Hi guys, welcome to the next part, the third part of the creating series. And and this part is chapter four, of course. We're still in chapter four, and this is called two different gaps in our knowledge. The use of externality pricing does rely on shaky information about how much is really worth to us to reduce externalities such as noise, accidents, pollution, and congestion. But this is not the only gap in our knowledge. We also do not know the cheapest way of reducing noise, accidents, pollution, and congestion. Interesting. It is with this second gap that externality pricing comes into its own. Externality pricing is no worse than any other policy when it comes to facing up the first kind of shaky information. We now know that any policy of um, we now know. I'm so sorry. Um, The real advantage of um, externality pricing is no worse than any other policy when it comes to facing up to the first kind of shake information. We now know that any policy of regulation, pricing, command, and tax control tax or license fair contains implicit or explicit assumptions about the scientific evidence on externalities like pollution and congestion, and the subjective preferences of people about their time, convenience, and health. No policy can be more successful than the accuracy of its assumption. The real advantage of externality pricing is that it circumvents the gap in our knowledge. Nobody knows the cheapest way of solving our traffic problems yet. But externality pricing brings pollution, congestion, and the rest inside the world of truth, which markets create for us. As long as individuals have to face the truth, or at least our best estimate of the cost of their actions, they will find a way to reduce these costs. The longer they have to respond, the more surprising and innovative the responses can be, as we are about to see. The New Orleans effect. A visit to New Orleans tells us how profoundly people can react to price signals. New Orleans displays a unique architectural style, the camelback house based on avoiding tax. In the late 19th century, houses were taxed based on the number of stories in the front. As the camelback design had one story at the front and more at the back, they are charming, but if it was practical design for a house, it would have caught on elsewhere. There is a similar story in Britain, which is full of dingy houses in response to the policy enforced from 1696 to 1851 of taxing people based on number of windows their homes had. Advocates of congestion charging believe that it must be easier to persuade people to find a way to make fewer trips by car than it is to persuade people to build their houses in architecturally innovative but wasteful style. Their expectation is that things wouldn't change much for a few weeks, but over the months and years, we would be living in a society where we could all get around safely and quickly. Congestion charging can change the small decisions we make every week about whether to drive to the supermarket, to catch the bus, or walk to the local store or buy food on the internet. But it will also weigh in the balance with the big decisions. Each year, 1 in 3 people change jobs and 1 in 7 people move. Every time that happens, there is a clear opportunity to reconsider travel choices in the light of congestion charging. There's also a domino effect here. As changes in behavior reinforce each other, if more people begin riding buses, there will be more room on the streets and buses will move more quickly and can cost effectively run more frequently. If more people join carpools, each person will find potential pool members more quickly and with more similar trips. If more people try to save the congestion charge by working at home a couple of days a week or commuting at a different time of the day, more companies will find way of accommodating them. People may try to live closer to their jobs, or companies may have moved to more rural areas to allow staff to commute without paying a high congestion charge. We simply do not know. The attractive thing about externality pricing is that it attacks the problem but makes no assumption about the solution. The congestion charge gives drivers a signal. By bringing your car into the town in rush hour, you are imposing a cost on everybody else. The drivers then have a choice: pay compensation or find a way to avoid imposing the cost. There are many ways to avoid that cost. The markets can produce the ingenuity needed to uncover them. When no externalities are present, market automatically take account of costs and provide incentives for producers to reduce them. When externalities are present, those costs are invisible to the market. But systems such as externality charging provide the missing signal that the cost exists. When London introduced a congestion charging zone in early 2003, charging €5 or €9 per day to drive into the city center, people responded far more quickly than many critics had expected. After a year, car rides fell by nearly a third. Trips that were exempt from the became more popular. That there were 15% more bus rides, 20% more motorcycle rides, and 30% more trips by bicycle. Drivers who no longer enter the charging zone have chosen a variety of response, one quarter drive around it, 55% have switched to public transportation, and 20% use alternatives like bicycles, carpools, or working from home on some days, while the number of trips by car fell. The total delays caused by congestion fell by much more, which suggests that the congestion charge allowed the streets to be much more efficiently used. And as people have more and more time to adjust to the congestion charge, the cost of dealing efficiently with this externality will fall further. Battling pollution on the cheap. In the 1990s, the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) in the United States discovered how cost effectively an externality charge could fight pollution when it decided to attack acid rain. The EPA wanted to reduce sulfur pollution from power stations. It seemed likely that some reduction would be efficient, but reducing pollution has costs as well as benefits. So the regulators were unsure by how much they could demand that pollution to be reduced. The trouble is that polluters will lie to regulators about what the cost of abatement really is. After all, even breathing emits a pollutant, carbon dioxide, but regulators could hardly demand that we all stop breathing to prevent pollution. So, which pollution should be reduced and how? By switching to different methods of power generation or reducing power consumption or something else. Ask the polluters, and they will all tell you that reducing their pollution is like stopping breathing. It would be very expensive to stop, and so somebody else should make the changes. But it's not only hard to find out the truth. Regulators can find out how much it costs to reduce pollution by telling people either to change their ways or pay a charge, which which decision they make. Judge them by their actions. The EPA tried this in the case of sulfur emissions. They set up an auction for the right to emit sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain. Polluters were given a quota of emission permits and could either buy more permits in the auction or reduce their emissions by shutting down, installing sulfur scrubbers, or buying cleaner coal. When the EPA simply tried to tell them to install sulfur scrubbers, the power generators argued that it would be very expensive to do so, and they lobbied hard to stop the mandatory regulation. Even the EPA estimated that the cost of reducing sulfur dioxide emissions by one ton would probably be in charge of 250 to 700 and might be as high as 1500 dollars. But when the EPA conducted the auction in 1993, very few polluters made high bids. The companies had been exaggerating their costs. By 1996, permit prices had fallen to a $70 a ton, and even at that price, many polluters were buying cleaner coal and installing scrubbers rather than buying permits to continue polluting. The regulators discovered that getting rid of the sulfur dioxide was so cheap that few people were willing to pay much higher for the right to keep producing it. In the end, the only people willing to pay high prices for permits were student environmental groups, buying single permits in an attempt to win 15 minutes of fame. The clever thing about the auction was that the sulfur emissions were reduced was not that the sulfur emissions were reduced, but that could have been required by law, but that legislators all over the world find out how much sulfur scrubbers really cost. It created a basis for further legislation, not making rules in the dark, but in full knowledge of the modest cost, and it has set an example to the world. For instance, Taiwan in northeast China is putting a similar plan into place. Now, economists are designing the same kind of auction for carbon dioxide emissions in a hope of reducing the effects of climate change. There is a massive controversy about how much reduction will cost, but an auction of permits to extract oil, coal, and gas would soon start to tell us. An auction could start gently in 2007, auctioning permits to extract the same number of tons of carbon as were extracted in 2006. Though this would require that economic growth take place without any growth in carbon emissions. If many environmentalists are to be believed, that the auction wouldn't even sell all the permits because basic energy efficiency measures cost nothing, we'd soon find out. Then over the next few years, we would auction fewer and fewer permits. Carbon emissions would probably fall faster than the number of permits because carbon spec, speculators would be buying the permits and hoarding them. This would cause no problems. The same emissions take place in the end but are delayed. If it turned out that the permits were expensive, then we would have the information for an informed debate. We could ask if the cost of climate change were worse than the cost of emission reduction. But many economists believe that, like sulfur permits in California, the carbon permits would quickly reveal that decarbonization is cheaper than we expected, and we will wonder why we took so long to start. Is the environment too important to be a moral issue? How did you travel here today? I'm sorry, I'm puzzled. Here I am, going to panel discussion organized by an environmental charity, and a very earnest young member of staff is grilling me before I even get past the door of the lecture hall. How did you travel here today? We need to know for our carbon offset program. What's a offset program? We want all our meetings to be carbon neutral. We ask everyone who attends to let us know how far they came and on what mode of transportation, and then we work out how much carbon dioxide was emitted and plant trees to offset the emissions. The undercover economist is about to blow this cover. I see. In that case, I came here in an anthracite powered steamer from Australia. Sorry, how do you spell anthracite? It's just a kind of coal, very dirty, lots of sulfur. Ow. The undercover economist's wife gave him a sharp dig in the ribs. Ignore him, we both cycled here. Oh, apart from being a good example of how irritating an undercover economist can be, this true story should, I hope, provoke a few questions. Why would an environmental charity organize a carbon neutral meeting? The obvious answer is so that it can engage in debate without contributing to climate change. And that is true but misleading. The undercover economist is me in me was looking at things from a point of view of efficiency. If planting trees is a good way to deal with climate change, why not forget about the meetings and plant as many as possible? In which case, everybody should say they came by steamship. If the awareness rising debate is an extra debates, in other words, why be carbon neutral when you can be carbon optimal? Essentially, since the meeting was not benzene neutral, lead neutral, particulate neutral, ozone neutral, sulfur neutral, congestion neutral, noise neutral, or accident neutral. Instead of working out whether to improve the environment directly by planting trees or indirectly by promoting discussion, the charity was spending considerable energy keeping itself precisely neutral, and not even precisely neutral on all externalities, not even a modest range of environmental toxins, but preserving its neutrality on a single high profile pollutant, carbon dioxide, and it was doing so in a very public way. A kind view would be that the charity was setting a good example of acting nonsensically can ever be, if acting nonsensically can ever be a good example. An unkind view would be that it was indulging in moral posturing. The line of reasoning make economists look too smug for their own good, but it is an important illustration of a wider point. The ethical showboating of an environmental charity can be directly connected to the fact that public policies do not make evident the environmental costs of our actions. If they did, environmentalists could argue their points from an economic standpoint. Much of the moral tone would drain out of the environmental debate, but the environment itself would be much more effectively dealt with. In a world where environmentalism is merely a moral issue, even the environmentalists themselves cannot work out the environmental impact of everyday decisions. Which is worse, disposable diapers, which clog up landfill sites, or washable diapers, where the washing process uses electricity and releases polluting detergents. Even with the best will, even with the best in the world, it is hard to know how to make the right choice. More importantly, the diaper problem, like any other environmental issue, large or small, will certainly not be solved by a tiny minority arguing not inconclusively over the morally appropriate individual action. While the green minority lacks the right signals about environmental damage to act appropriately, the majority of people would not inconvenience themselves even if they understood environmental problems. Both information and incentives are necessary, and we discovered in Chapter 3 markets can provide both. Economists have long been in the forefront of analyzing environmental problems, and this di- difficulty is why they advocate externality pricing. Economists care about the environment but dream of a world where it is no longer an issue that invites moral posturing, but is properly integrated into markets and the world of truth, which would provide both the information and the incentives necessary to persuade ordinary people to behave in an environmentally responsible way. In such a world, we would all have clear signals about the cost of our actions within the marketplace. Plastics might well be taxed because they do not biodegrade and so fill landfill sites. This would discourage the use of plastic packaging, disposable plastic bags, and plastic diaper liners. People would use only the more expensive plastics if the convenience it provided was worth the extra money, as it probably is in the case of diapers, but might well not be in the case of plastic packaging. Electricity generation that contributed to climate change would be taxed too, which would raise electricity prices unless we could develop cleaner fuels. Diaper washers and everybody else too would have an incentive to buy more efficient washing machines and cut down on energy use generally. Instead of fretting about the environmental impact of our decisions, we would be well aware that if we are willing to pay the externality charge on a product such as a diaper, we would be compensating others for the harm done by our actions. And at the same time, we would be confident that the harm was less than our own convenience. We might even find that there are easier ways to improve our environment than by messing around with diapers. They're messy enough already. Being positive. This is the next topic, being positive. We've spent a lot of space on what economists call negative externalities, unpleasant side effects of actions people get away with scot free. Once you start to think about the idea of negative externalities, you quickly realize that there must be positive externalities too. There are pleasant side effects of things people do for which they are not rewarded. If Abraham paints the front of his house and sorts out his garden, the whole street looks better as a result. But nobody will offer to pay for his paint or pruning shears. If Belinda opens an attractive sidewalk cafe, the streets are more pleasant to walk along. But her clients will be willing to pay only for their own pleasure, not for the pleasure of bystanders. And if Craig decides to vaccinate his son for measles, mumps, and rubella, this means other children are less likely to catch the diseases. But the government can only go so far in encouraging Craig to do so. Positive externalities all seem very agreeable until you realize that Abraham may decide he can't be bothered to paint his house. Belinda, fearing bankruptcy, may not set up her cafe, and Craig may decide that he is too worried about the possible side effects of the vaccines to take his son to the doctor. The rest of us would have benefited if they had gone ahead, but they each decided to that on balance it wasn't worthwhile. Just as negative externalities will tend to lead to too much pollution or congestion, positive externalities will leave us undervaccinated with scruffy neighbors and dearth of pleasant cafes. And while negative externalities attract all the attention, positive externalities may be even more important. So many of the things that make life worth living are in fact subject to positive externalities and are underprovided. Freedom from disease, honesty in public life, vibrant neighborhoods, and technological innovation. Once we realize the importance of positive externalities, the obvious solution is the mirror image of the politics policies we considered to deal with negative externalities. Instead of an externality charge, an externality subsidy. Vaccinations are, for example, are often subsidized by governments or by aid agencies. Scientific research, too, usually gets a big dose of government funding, but we need to be realistic about how far all this should go. Because although externality charges and subsidies seem a great fix for externalities, there may be an unexpected hiccup. Too much of a good thing. Next topic. Too much of a good thing. Solving externalities without the government. When is an externality not an externality? Here's an example. I may complain about my neighbor's tree damaging my wall, but if it really bothers me, I can pay him to let me cut it down. If he refuses the offer, then I have to conclude that he gets more pleasure out of the tree than I get nuisance. And in fairness, it should stay up. Or perhaps I have the right in law to force my neighbor to cut down the tree. But in that case, he can pay me not to exercise that right. and I can spend some of the money fixing my wall. If I have the right to decide that then I end up richer. If he has the right to decide, he ends up richer. But either way, the tree stays up, and if it's worth more to him, and it comes down to it's more irritating to me. And it comes down if it's but either way the tree stays up if it's worth more to him, and it comes down if it's more irritating to me. The externalities simply aren't externalities if people can easily get together and negotiate. Remember that they were called externalities because they stood outside market transactions. But some of the things that we imagine to stand outside the market can easily be brought into it. Since these pseudo externalities can in fact be dealt with very well by the private sector, if the government also steps in with an externality charge, we may find ourselves solving the externality twice. This would be just as undesirable as not solving it at all. Instead of having too much pollution from power generation, we exaggerate the cost and overcompensate by switching off our freezers and street lights and walking to restaurants every evening in the dark. How would you get this kind of overdose of a remedy for externalities? When mentioning the case of Abraham painting the front of his house, I, I glibly said that the neighbors wouldn't compensate him for his paint. But in fact, such things have mm, have been known to happen. It's particularly common for landlords to buy paints for tenants to deal with a positive externality. If the tenants repaint, they get a more pleasant apartment, but the landlord will also find it easier to rent it out in the future. Taking into account the advantage to both landlord and tenants, the apartment is worth painting. But without cash from the landlord, the tenants may decide it's not worth the bother. By providing paint, the landlord shares the cost that as he will also enjoy the benefits. It might well be that in this case, what appeared to be an externality has been internalized by bargaining over sharing the costs. But what if the government has been thinking about subsidies for positive externalities? Imagine that the policy wonks wrongly believe that whenever an apartment is being rented, landlords and tenants would renovate too frequently and let the place fall apart. It isn't worth it either for the tenants or for the landlord to refurbish more often. But if either of them were taking the other's interest into account, they would agree to do the work. Seeing this positive externality, the government starts dishing out externality subsidies of $500 to tenants who renovate their apartments. If you find this implausible, remember that governments certainly grant subsidies for improvements to the energy efficiency of homes, which produce a positive externality. Imagine that the redecorating effort is worth $300 of cleaner living in the tenants and $500 of higher future rents to the landlords. But that it costs $1,000. The government has identified the externality perfectly. $100 of benefits, higher rents to the landlord that the tenants do not take into account. But note that since $300 plus $500 is less than $1,000, the subsidy is not enough to persuade the tenants to redecorate. Nor should it be, because the redecorating is clearly more trouble than it is worth to both landlord and tenants. Unfortunately, the tenants have every incentive to pocket the $500 subsidy and ask the landlord to chip in another, say $350. Then they are doing very nicely, enjoying a $1,000 renovation for only $150 because 85% is paid by the landlord, or the government, and which is worth to them. The landlord is willing to pay along because he pays 350 for a renovation which is worth $500 to him. But the redecoration should never have happened. After all, the government has spent $500 but managed to make tenants and landlords only $150 each better off. Not a very effective way to give money away. Why does the problem arise? Because the positive externality has been dealt with twice over, once by government subsidy and once by process of bargaining. Either solution alone represents an efficient way for the society to deal with externalities and to come to the right conclusion, which in this case is that the positive externality is not too much subsidy of positive externalities. The positive externality is not large enough to justify the decoration work. Both solutions together mean that there is too much subsidy of positive externalities. The same thing could happen for negative externalities too. If the government taxes my neighbor's dirty gas powered lawnmower combination, if the taxes and my own offer may persuade him to ditch the monster, even though the fun and convenience he gets from the thing outweigh my any damage to anyone else and he really should be kept going. Yes, many externalities are very real. Also the cozy if cracks wall of our gardens or our unpainted apartments, we still have clogged streets. Traffic congestion is not easily solved by sitting down over a cup of coffee and making a deal. There are too many people involved. Enforcing the agreement would be impossible, and there would always be temptation for many to avoid the costly negotiations but hope to enjoy the benefits for free. Government imposed externality charging is far more likely to be appropriate in situations where the um, appropriate in situations where a negotiation over the externality will not work, as in the case of noise from low flying aircraft. The more people are likely to be able to sit down around the table and work something out, the more likely government intervention is to screw things up. First, because governments can be swayed by interest groups and so they do not always act in the public interest. Second, because of the overdose problem. And last, because people know the truth about their costs and benefits better than any government ever could. Externality pricing will work very well for problems such as congestion and climate change, for which individual negotiation is nearly impossible. For smaller scale situations, we must ask whether the government imposed cures are worse than the disease. Epilogue. What is economics really about? This chapter has proposed ways of dealing with some of the major blights on our society, pollution, congestion, and fights with neighbors. We've learned that an externality charge on waste or on driving in congested areas or a subsidy for research or vaccinations is the most efficient way of dealing with many of the problems that the market leaves to one side. Externality charges give people both the information to make the right choices and the incentives to do so. Such charges do not automatically answer the question of how tough regulation should be or what should be regulated. But once our political processes have produced a view about what we want, they provide the most cost effective way of getting there. Yet you will often hear so-called experts complaining that taxes on driving or on pollution would be bad for the country. That sounds worrying, but what is the economy if you spend enough time watching Bloomberg television or reading the Wall Street Journal? You may come to the mistaken impression that the economy is a bunch of rather dull statistics with names like GDP. GDP measures the total cost of producing everything in the economy in 1 year. For instance, one extra cappuccino would add $2.55 to GDP, or a little less if some of the ingredients were imported. And if you think this is the economy, then the experts may be right. A pollution tax might well make a number like GDP smaller, but who cares? Certainly not economists. We know that GDP measures lots of things that are harmful: sales of weapons, shoddy building work with subsequent expensive repairs, expenditure on commuting, and misses lot of things that are important, such as looking after your children or going for a walk in the mountains. Most economics has very little to do with GDP. Economics is about who gets what and why. Clean air and smooth flowing traffic are part of the economy. In this sense, if it's possible that congestion charging would would increase GDP because people would get to work more quickly and produce more, and prices in stores would be lower because of more efficient distribution. But it's perfectly possible that congestion charging would reduce the GDP. This does not, in fact, matter in the slightest. We know for certain that it would make us better off in a much more meaningful sense, that we would have many choices open us about where we go and what we do. There is much more than life. In life, there's much more to life than what gets measured in accounts. Even economists know that. That was the end of chapter 4, and I found this chapter really entertaining, and I was struggling to read some of the topics like the charges, like how does the charges really work. But with the subsidy example, I think things are more clear for me. And with that, this is the end of the chapter. I love this chapter.